Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks to our speakers and our great moderator. Thanks to Bart for setting everything up. And yeah, let's get started.
Good to be with all y'all this evening. My name is Jack Hunter. My radio nickname moniker is the Southern Avenger, and I'll be moderating the panel this evening on civil liberties. I'd like to thank Young Americans for Liberty and the Future of Freedom Foundation for hosting this event. Did any of you happen to watch any of the debate? Do you feel so much better about the future of this country at this point? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about probably what wasn't mentioned during the debate. We got to hear about 30 minutes of it on the way over here, and I didn't hear anything about civil liberties. Was it ever brought up? Probably not, I'm guessing, right? Well, there's a reason for that, and that's because they really don't have anything to debate. You had one candidate in that debate tonight, who's the President of the United States, who promised to do things like repeal the Patriot Act and close Guantanamo Bay, and not only has he not done either of those things, but he's out-Bushed Bush by giving us something worse than the Patriot Act and the National Defense Authorization Act. If the Patriot Act was controversial, not only because it spied on citizens, but gave the government, the executive branch, the power to use indefinite detention on enemy combatants and other classifications, Barack Obama has given us the NDAA, which can impose indefinite detention on American citizens. He has taken it a step further. You had another candidate in that debate last night that would like to be president, Republican Mitt Romney, who you would think if he was smart, his argument with Barack Obama would be that you shouldn't assume more executive power for the executive branch, as your predecessor did, and you've done it even worse. You should respect the Fourth Amendment and care about the Constitution. Maybe we shouldn't be doing some of the things overseas that your predecessor did to really no good end, and you continue to do in places like Libya. We're starting new wars. But no, Mitt Romney has gone in the exact opposite direction. His attitude is that Barack Obama is not tough enough, and he tries to portray him as weak, when if you look at it in any sort of reasonable sense, Barack Obama is Bush 2, and Mitt Romney or Obama 3 would be Bush 3. So there's really no end in sight when it comes to these issues. Well, tonight we're going to talk about what I think is the consensus, and this is a bipartisan consensus in our politics, that the Constitution simply doesn't matter anymore. The idea that we have individual freedoms, that we have a right to privacy, and that we have individual liberties, that are historic American liberties, protected by the founding charter of this country, the U.S. Constitution, is something both parties just don't care about anymore. Was it in tonight's debate? And it's hard to think of it being in future debates. We're going to hear about these issues from the perspective of the left or the liberal perspective, the conservative perspective or the right, and also the libertarian perspective. And we'll find there's a lot to agree on coming from what most people think of as three very different perspectives. We're going to hear from these speakers, and afterwards we're going to do a Q&A so you can ask us questions, and it's going to be a fun evening, and I appreciate everyone coming. Our first speaker this evening is Jacob Hornberger, who will be representing the libertarian perspective. Jacob Hornberger is the founder and president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. He received his BA degree in economics from the Virginia Military Institute and his law degree from the University of Texas. He was a civil and criminal trial attorney in Texas for 12 years and also served as an adjunct professor of law and economics at the University of Dallas. He used to be a regular libertarian commentator on Judge Andrew Napolitano's Freedom Watch on Fox Business, and rest in peace, that was one of the best shows out there when you're talking about civil liberties. And Jacob has been a long-time spokesman for liberty and champions the ideas of freedom. The Future of Freedom Foundation has done that for decades. Ladies and gentlemen, Jacob Hornberger.
Thank you very much, and it's nice to be here with y'all. I want to especially thank the Young Americans for Liberty. The way you guys are organizing these events is just fantastic for us. It's so nice to be partnering with you in this endeavor. This is actually part 2 of the College Civil Liberties Tour. We did one last winter over on the East Coast with 4 colleges, and y'all put them together there, and they were such a great success, and we were also pumped up after them that we said, hey, let's do this again, let's go out west. And I know the work that goes into organizing these events, and so thank you, Colby, and thank this great organization, YAL. It's nice to be here with you. A few minutes before the event this evening, a young lady came over to me and said that she was looking forward to the debate. And I said, what debate are you referring to? And she says, well, here, debate. And ironically, she wasn't the only one who said it. That last night, but when we kicked this tour off at the University of Washington in Seattle, same thing. Somebody came up and said, boy, I'm really looking forward to this debate. And then back at Columbia University, back in winter, same thing. Somebody was saying, we're looking forward to the debate. Well, you'd think that there'd be a debate, right? You got a conservative, you got a liberal, you got a libertarian. But guess what? It's not a debate. What you're going to see tonight is three perspectives. A liberal perspective, a conservative perspective, and a libertarian perspective on what all three of us consider is the most important issue of our lifetime. Regardless of how old you are. That this is the burning issue of our lifetime. It trumps every other issue. And that is this issue of civil liberties within the context of this war on terrorism and foreign policy. Those of you that are in college right now, you've sort of grown up in this environment of the war on terrorism, 9/11, what you've maybe 8, 9, 10 years old when it all happened. And then you've kind of grown up, in your teenage years with it. And it's sort of like, it's like part of your life, oh, terrorism alerts and the terrorists are coming to get us and oh my gosh, we got to have this emergency powers and I mean, it's like this constantly on your mind. Oh, got to invade Afghanistan, got to invade Iraq, got to invade Iran, got to start wars in Libya and Syria. It's just part of everyday life. And we saw it in my generation, back then the big bugaboo was communism. Oh man, the communists are coming to get us. Oh man, we got to have this vast military establishment. We got to have the CIA. We've got to have, the military-industrial complex. We've got to have ever-soaring military budgets because the communists are coming. And we were having to look under our beds for the communists, Next week, you're going to see a, quote, debate between Obama and Romney on foreign policy. It's not going to be a debate either because they're going to agree on everything. They're going to agree on things that are fundamental. I mean, they'll disagree on how to manage this system under which we're all living now. Like one will say, well, I'm going to bomb more countries than you. And the other is going to say, well, that may be, but I'm going to assassinate more people than you. Okay? And the other one's going to say, yeah, but boy, when it comes to torture, I'm going to beat you. Okay? But neither one of them is going to do what we're going to do tonight. And that's what challenge the system itself. And that's what we're here about. We're talking about challenging the entire paradigm under which we're living. A paradigm that they tell us is constant, permanent, that you can't do anything about. Deal with it, they tell you. That the war on terrorism is here for the rest of your lives. Out of control federal spending, military spending, get used to it. National debt soaring through the roof, you're going to have to pay for it. And notice that that's what they say on the national debt. Hey, don't worry, we'll all be dead, man. We'll just pass it on to the young people. And that's you that they're talking about. You owe right now around $51,000. As soon as you graduate from college, that's your share of the national debt. And it just keeps piling. Now, what is this system that we're talking about? We're talking about a vast empire. And that's the only proper word that can be used. An empire of military bases all over the world. 130 countries. About 1,000 military bases. Even the Romans would have been proud of this system. You've got invasions, you've got occupations, sanctions, embargoes. You've got an embargo against the Cuban people that's lasted for some 50 years. Communism, the communists from Cuba might come and get us. And they squeeze the lifeblood out of the Cuban people. I've been to Cuba. People are suffering. On the verge of starvation, not just because of their system there, but because also this embargo. And now we see it against the Iranians. where the Iranian people are suffering economically now because of this embargo, and the U.S. officials are happy about it. Oh, this is fantastic. There's discontent there. Maybe they'll oust their dictatorial regime. Torture, kidnappings, renditions. This is the system. And we're all taught that it's just normal, that this is a free society. Weren't you inculcated with the notion from the first grade on up that you live in a free country? That thank God you're an American because at least you know you're free? You go to ball games and you stand up and you say, man, let's praise the troops because they're defending our freedom. Well, which implies you're free. You know, if the troops weren't fighting in Afghanistan, we wouldn't be in this assembly, right? There wouldn't be football games and there wouldn't be sports events and stuff. Praise the troops. Right? I mean, it's just sort of a natural, normal part of life. Well, let me tell you something. It's not normal. It's aberrant. It's bizarre. It's weird. It's dysfunctional. This is not the way life is supposed to be lived. And it's not a free society. It's as far from a free society as you could ever find. And you can sit here and convince yourself you're free, but convincing yourself something that isn't true doesn't affect the reality of it. It actually makes you less free. You know, there's a great German thinker, Johann von Goethe, who really summed up the plight of the American people today. None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. I mean, think about it. What greater slave is there than the slave who thinks he's free? He has no incentive to break his chains. He praises his taskmasters for his slavery, for having the opportunity to serve them. 9/11 comes along. And what did they say? What motivated the 9/11? Oh, you're not supposed to talk about motivation. That justifies it. Oh, you're defending the terrorists. No, we don't want to go down that road. Well, except for the fact that they hate us for our freedom and values. It's okay to say that. See, the terrorists just hate us for our freedom and values, and they come and attack us, and oh my gosh, we're just innocent over here, just minding our own business. It's like the flu. You know, terrorism's like the flu. Oh gosh, it's come to America. Isn't it interesting that you don't see Swiss ambassadors getting killed in Libya or Syria or anywhere else? That's just an American ambassador? Isn't that interesting? I mean, why would they target an American ambassador? Why would they target the World Trade Center? Why not target Bern, Switzerland? You see, and that's the question we're not supposed to ask. You're not supposed to use your mind in that area. But you have to. I mean, it's natural to ask that question. Why do they hate us? Is it really because of rock and roll? Elvis Presley? Our churches? Our way of life? I mean, take Iran, for instance. You know, Iran's actually a great example of everything that's going on. I mean, here these people are suffering under this brutal dictatorship. We all acknowledge that. But does anybody know who it was that destroyed Iran's experiment with democracy? Now notice that Obama's over here saying, oh, we got these sanctions there because we're about democracy spreading. We want to spread democracy to Iran, and we're going to squeeze the lifeblood out of the Iranian people. Well, guess what? It was the U.S. government that destroyed their experiment with democracy. You see, in 1979, there was the Iranian Revolution, and they took all these U.S. diplomats hostage. Why did they do that? You know, the revolutionaries did. Why did they do that? They kidnapped them. They held them hostage for over a year. Why? Yeah, they were angry. It wasn't that they hated us for our freedom and values. They were angry. And why were they angry? Because they had discovered that some 25 years before, the CIA had gone into Iran and ousted their democratically elected prime minister, a man named Mohammad Mossadegh, Time Magazine Man of the Year, highly respected, highly revered in Iran. And the CIA went in there and engineered a coup to help out the British Empire that had lost its oil concessions in Iran. They ousted him and they installed a Shah of Iran who turned out to be one of the most brutal dictators in history. And then they helped him fortify his control over the Iranian people, training his forces how to torture people, how to put them in jail without trials, how to keep them there indefinitely, and to maintain dictatorial power. But you see, he was pro-US. He was one of ours. So it's all okay. Except the victims of this didn't like it. And that's the Iranian people. And so they have this revolution. Unfortunately, they end up with another horrible dictatorship. But they've never forgotten who it was that did this. And so when they see themselves today surrounded by the U.S. military, is it any surprise that they're sitting here saying, we're going to see a repeat of this? A repeat of what we saw back in 53? And that's really what the sanctions are all about, regime change. They're trying to install another pro-U.S. dictator. All the stuff about WMDs and nuclear bombs, it's the same nonsense we saw with Iraq. Oh, by the way, yes, Iraq's another dictator that they supported, Saddam Hussein. Yeah, they supported him. They partnered with him throughout the 1980s. And then when they turned on him, they couldn't get rid of him, which they tried to do in the Persian Gulf War. So what they did the same thing that they're doing to the Iranians today. They imposed one of the most brutal regimes of sanctions in history. So total and so complete that children were dying every year in mass. Tens of thousands every year. It was horrific. 2 high officials of the United Nations resigned in protest of this, what they called genocide. This is our government doing this. It's not the type of thing you're going to see in your public schools as you're being raised. You're not going to learn about this. But those children were dying year after year, and you know what? You know what the official mindset of the U.S. government was? Doesn't matter. Because we're bringing democracy to Iraq. We're trying to get rid of Saddam Hussein. So it's okay if the children die because the greater good is worth the sacrifice of these children. And in fact, Madeleine Albright, who was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, our official representative to this world body, 60 Minutes asked her, there's been 500,000 children who have died so far with the sanctions. Would you say it's worth it, Ms. Albright? She paused and said, well, it's a tough issue, but yeah, it's worth it. It's incredible. And you see, in her mind, she's doing good. But in the mindsets of the Iraqi people in the Middle East, there was anger, there was rage, it was boiling under the surface. And we said at the Future of Freedom Foundation before 9/11, if you don't stop this, along with the other junk you're doing, the unconditional support of the Israeli regime, regardless of how they treat the Palestinians, the stationing of U.S. troops in Mecca and Medina, the holiest lands in the Muslim religion, the so-called no-fly zones that was killing teenagers over Iraq with missiles and bombs and stuff. If you don't stop this, there's going to be a terrorist attack on American soil. We were saying this at the Future of Freedom Foundation. And it didn't take a rocket scientist. There had been a terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. It was in principle the exact same thing 8 years earlier. Attack on the USS Cole, a ship of the United States, an attack on the U.S. embassies in East Africa. And every time you talk to these terrorists that are doing this, the Fort Hood bomber, the Detroit bomber, every one of these people, their rage is directed to what the U.S. government was doing in the Middle East. And so it culminates with 9/11. And then what do? U.S. officials say, no, that has nothing to do with what we're doing to people over there because we're a force for good in the world. So we're going to do more of the same. So the sanctions hadn't gotten rid of Saddam, so they invade Iraq. And they use the WMD scare as the fake and bogus rationale for invading the country. They kill countless more Iraqis. We don't even know how many they killed. But it's worth it, you see. Except for the victims. They might disagree, and the families of the victims. And then Afghanistan. And there's your anger and your rage. And you see, and then what they do is, when people out of this anger and rage come back to retaliate, what do? U.S. officials? They take away our freedom. I mean, do you realize now that the U.S. military has the power to round up any number of Americans at once simply by labeling them terrorists, carting them away to a concentration camp or a military dungeon, torture them, and possibly even execute them after some sort of kangaroo tribunal like the kind they have in Guantanamo? That's the kind of country we're living in now. It's extraordinary. It's normal for those of you that are raised in this thing. I mean, you think, oh, well, gosh, yeah, this is free society, yeah. I mean, this is what happens in free societies. To put things in context, that power, the power to round up people and cart them away on the power of the military, that's what the protesters in Egypt were demanding that Mubarak and that military dictatorship in Egypt relinquish, because that dictatorship has the same power. And they were exercising it. They've been exercising it for 30 years. It was a temporary power. Just like George Bush says, it's a temporary emergency power we're exercising here. This temporary emergency power has lasted 11 years. In Egypt, the military dictatorship has exercised it for 30 years. That's what they mean by temporary. That is not what America is all about. It's not what a free society is all about. That's not what the framers had in mind when they had a constitution that limited the powers of this government. You know, a lot of Americans didn't even favor calling the federal government into existence. They opposed the Constitution because they said, if you call this federal government into existence, it's going to turn out to be like all other governments in history. They're going to have a vast military establishment. They're going to use that military against the citizenry. And the framers said, no. That will never happen because this is going to be a document of enumerated limited powers. There's going to be no standing army. They won't have the power because they won't have the standing army. And to make certain that they don't have this power, we're going to have a Bill of Rights that is going to include 4 amendments that's going to prohibit the federal government from conducting unreasonable searches and seizures without warrants, that's going to prohibit them from taking people's life or liberty or property without due process of law. It's going to prohibit them from inflicting cruel and unusual punishments on people. So here you're safeguarding. And it worked pretty much. I mean, there's been attacks on it on the margin over the decades, the drug war. But we have the ignominious position our generation's living today, where they made a permanent modification of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights without even the semblance of an amendment. By nullifying those amendments and those limited enumerated powers simply by decree. Simply by saying 9/11 is an emergency, we now have these same powers as the military dictatorship in Egypt. And for that matter, in Chile under Pinochet, where he rounded up 50, 60,000 people with his power and killed and tortured and raped 3,000 of them. That's not what a free society is all about. That's not what America is all about. And the question is, what do we do about it? And now they'll tell you this is permanent. Can't do anything about it. Nonsense. That is nonsense. One of the most powerful forces in the universe in which we live is the power of a small movement of determined people to bring about change in society with principles and ideals and ideals. And that's where you come in. That's why we're here. To raise your vision to a higher level. To be unwilling to accept the society in which you have been born and raised. To end this injustice. To end this humiliation and abuse of people around the world. To dismantle this empire. Bring all those troops home. Discharge them into the private sector. Restore the principles of a limited government republic to our land. Restore our liberties. The liberties that people fought for when they got those 4 amendments into that Bill of Rights. Can it be done? Well, of course it can. I mean, you can see the great movements, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, habeas corpus. They were all begun with small groups of determined people. The Arab Spring. These are small groups of people. And that's what we're about. That's what the three of us, the four of us, are all about. We want to change the world. That's why we're here. We want to change the world, but we need your help. And you say, well, what can I do? Well, you got to figure that out. But the first thing you got to figure out is how important it is to you to live in a free society. To delve into this issue. And after this program's over, later on, if you put your email address on the list, I'll be sending you some resources where you can dive into this and become more aware of how wrong this is. And then you decide where you fit in, what best you can do to change the world, and to change the world by changing America and leading the world out of this horrific morass. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker represents what some would call the left or liberal perspective on civil liberties. Glenn Greenwald is a columnist for The Guardian, a former constitutional and civil rights litigator, and is the author of 3 New York Times best-selling books on the Bush administration's executive power and foreign policy abuses. Greenwald was named by The Atlantic as one of the 25 most influential political commentators in the nation. He is the recipient of the first annual I.F. Stone Award for Independent Journalism and is the winner of the 2010 Online Journalism Association Award for his investigative work on the arrest and oppressive detention of Bradley Manning. You know, during the Bush-Cheney years, Glenn would criticize the Bush administration and attack them for their assaults on civil liberties, and the left absolutely loved Mr. Greenwald. Now that there's a Democratic president doing it in office, he attacks the same president for the same abuses, even worse abuses, and many of his liberal friends aren't so happy with him all the time. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Glenn Greenwald.
Good evening, and thanks very much for coming out tonight. As Jacob said, this is the second part, the sort of sequel of our Civil Liberties tour. We did one 6 months or so ago on the East Coast and in the Midwest, and what we found was that the most vibrant and constructive part of the evening tended to be the question and answer session that followed our speaking. So we're all making very diligent efforts to confine ourselves to a much shorter time period than we're accustomed to speaking, in order to leave as much time as possible for a Q&A session. And as a result, I'm going to just try and rush into the sort of core issues that I think are most important to consider when we talk about civil liberties in the United States, what I really think is kind of the crux of the matter. And to do that, I think the first thing that it's really worth doing is to look at the title that we've given to this event, which is Civil Liberties Tour, and to begin by asking, what is it that we even mean when the word civil liberties, the term civil liberties, is used? Because it's often the case that in our political discourse, lots of terms get tossed around with great regularity, and many of those terms are very ill-defined. We don't think very much about what exactly it is that we even mean by the terms that we use. And so I think it's really worth taking a minute to even ask, what is this term civil liberties? What does it denote? And the reason why I think that's a valuable exercise and not a very difficult exercise ultimately is because the term civil liberties is really not that complex of a concept. It's actually really quite simple. What it really means is the list of limitations that we've imposed on what the government can do to us in its exercise of power. We've essentially told the government we're willing to recognize the legitimacy and validity of your power, provided that there are certain lines that you never cross. And the really good thing about thinking about that concept is that this list is not very difficult to find. It's not hidden. You don't have to have a scavenger hunt to go and find it. It's actually all contained in one place, in one document called the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. And the other very good thing about this list, this concept, is that these limitations that we've imposed on the government are very clear and absolute in their prohibitions, in their mandates. So there's not very much ambiguity or complexity to it. There's not a lot of debate really needed or warranted to understand what they are. They're extremely both clear and absolute. So if you look at the First Amendment, it says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. If you look at the Fourth Amendment, it says there shall be no unreasonable searches and seizures of our houses, our papers, or our homes without probable cause warrants, search warrants issued upon a finding of probable cause. If you look at the Fifth Amendment, it says that no person shall have life or liberty or property deprived without due process of law. These are extraordinarily extreme terms by their very nature. I remember I had this really acrimonious exchange a few years ago with Joe Klein, who's a writer for Time magazine. I actually had a bunch of acrimonious exchanges with him, but one in particular that I'm thinking about took place, I think, in like 2007 or 2008, and I don't remember exactly what the argument was about, but it was very confrontational, very acrimonious. And in the middle of the sort of 2-week-long exchange that we had, he wrote this column and was responding to something that I wrote. And in the middle of it, he sort of said something like, well, in any event, Glenn Greenwald is a civil liberties extremist. And I was reading this and I got to that sentence and I honestly, this is truly my reaction, I read that, I was really all of a sudden kind of baffled, because I was thinking, here we're having this extremely vituperative exchange, calling each other all sorts of names, and yet all of a sudden, in the middle of it, he decided to pay me this really nice compliment, calling me a civil liberties extremist. Why did he suddenly get so nice and decide to lavish me with that praise? And then it took me a minute, and I realized, no, actually, you know what? It's really strange. I think he means that as an insult. Like, civil liberties extremist, that's a bad thing for him to be. And the reason why it was so baffling to me is because that, to me, is the greatest compliment someone can pay me, because it's really a term that is the only way to believe in civil liberties is to be extremist about it, because, as I said, the prohibitions that we've imposed on the government are absolute in their nature. And by that, what I mean is that we don't disallow the government or prohibit the government from crossing these lines in certain circumstances. We haven't said to the government, you're permitted to abridge free speech or to deprive liberty or life without due process. In these circumstances, you're only to adhere to those prohibitions under certain conditions. That's not what we said. We said you are never to violate these lines or transgress these limitations, no matter what the justification, no matter how compelling you think the circumstances are, no matter how aggressively you argue that doing so is necessary for our public welfare or for our own safety. And you see that value embedded in all sorts of ways in the Constitution, both as it was created originally and as we've always understood it. So if you look, for example, at the Fourth Amendment, which most people are familiar with, that bars searches and seizures without a search warrant, it's a fairly amazing decision that those who wrote the Constitution and then those who ratified it made, because telling the state and its law enforcement agents and police that you cannot enter our homes unless you first can demonstrate to a court that there's probable cause to think that we've done something illegal is a pretty risky commitment to make, because if you were to allow the police to simply enter whatever homes they want at will whenever they want to, that would probably be a lot better for law enforcement. If there were a rapist on the loose or a mass murderer or a child molester or someone committing all kinds of horrible crimes or a terrorist, the police would have a much better chance of catching that person if they could just invade whatever homes they want, search through whatever they want at will. But the decision was made that there are more important things than that level of safety, than empowering the police to catch criminals or to protect the community from people who are menacing it. The decision was made that the values of privacy, of being able to limit state power, were of such supreme importance that we were demanding that it be adhered to, even if it meant sacrificing some degree of our own public safety. That was the value judgment that defined the United States, and the reason it was made was because there was an understanding that unless if the tyranny that the founders had just waged a difficult war to free themselves from was going to be avoided in the future, these limitations had to be absolute in nature. They had to be adhered to in all circumstances. And that's what makes these rights so absolute. If they're not absolute, they essentially don't exist. And one of the most amazing things is if you look at exactly these rights, the ones that I just described, you see that these rights are the ones that we've allowed to be violated, not in ancillary and isolated ways, but really in systematic ways. So if you look at prosecutions over the last decade in the United States, primarily of Muslim Americans, but now increasingly of dissidents as well, for things like materially supporting terrorism, what you see are people being prosecuted for statements that they've made about United States foreign policy, even things like uploading YouTube clips that are critical of U.S. foreign policy, and the government says, therefore, is likely to glorify terrorist aims and help terrorists. If you look at the massive surveillance state that has been created in the United States. The Washington Post 2 years ago said that every single day, the National Security Agency monitors and stores 1.8 billion electronic communications between citizens in the United States. There's monitoring of all kinds of activity on the part of everyday ordinary citizens with no demonstration that they've done anything wrong. It's a systematic violation of this Fourth Amendment prohibition on searches and seizures without a search warrant, as one can possibly imagine. And then if you look at the Fifth Amendment prohibition on depriving life or liberty without due process, you see that the government has asserted the right systematically to imprison people indefinitely without charges of any kind. That's what Guantanamo is, the worldwide system of lawless prisons is, and even now to target even American citizens for assassination without charges of any kind, the ultimate deprivation of life without due process. And so all of these core defining liberties, what we call civil liberties, what were intended to be the only guarantee against replicating the tyranny of the British king and all other tyrannies, are being systematically violated. It's not very difficult to demonstrate. And so I just want to spend the bulk of my time asking the question of why it is that we've allowed that to happen. What is it that makes it so difficult to fight and to convince other people to object to in a meaningful and effective way? So I just want to go over a few of the reasons that I think this is happening and we've allowed it to happen. And the first of those is that there is a perception by design that this repression, these abuses, this violation of these rights is affecting only a marginalized minority group. The history of the way governments abuse power is that they target what they perceive to be a very unpopular, unsympathetic group on the grounds that there is an expectation that because they're targeting that group and only that group, everybody else in the society will be apathetic about the abuses, and the abuses will therefore become institutionalized, and then they can spread. Obviously, lots of different groups have played this role throughout American history, African Americans being the most prominent and the most sustained. But currently, over the last 10 years, the group that is the target of that repression is American Muslims, with 9/11 as the justification. And there is a perception that because only Muslims are really targeted by things like indefinite detention or lawless assassinations or prosecutions based on core First Amendment activity, that there's no real reason to object, that it's not really a crisis, not really urgent, because we're not in that group and therefore we're unlikely to be targeted by that. Now, leave aside the grotesque immorality of deciding that you're only going to care about injustices if they directly affect you, and you'll be apathetic about them if they don't. If somebody's in that posture, there's not much you can do to appeal to them morally. But just pragmatically, it's a really warped and ill-advised way of thinking. And the reason is that it is always the case, not sometimes the case, not usually the case, but always the case, that abuses of government power extend far beyond their original application. If you look at how the Patriot Act was justified when it was enacted, it was supposed to be a temporary measure designed to combat terrorism. But if you look at how it's been used over the last decade, it has been used overwhelmingly in cases having nothing to do with terrorism. Only in very rare cases has it been used that way. It's been used in cases completely unrelated and in all sorts of other areas. If you look at the way in which the FBI has entrapped all sorts of young Muslims and manipulated them to join plots that were created and funded and shaped by the FBI, only for the FBI to jump in at the last minute and heroically announce that they saved us from their own plots, what you see is that tactic now being used against anarchists, against people protesting NATO policies, against the Occupy movement, all kinds of ways that these tactics that were originally confined to Muslims are now spreading far beyond that. And what happens is if you allow abuses of power to take root on the grounds that you don't really care because they're only confined to that one group, what then happens is because they become legitimized, because they become an important part of our political framework, they get the approval of the citizenry, of courts, of Congress, of the law, it becomes impossible to object either on principled grounds or in any way that's effective once those abuses start spreading beyond their original application, as they inevitably do. But that's a very powerful tool to convince the citizenry to acquiesce to power abuses, this idea of self-interest that it only affects this one group that we're targeting and therefore you shouldn't care. The second reason that it is happening, I think, that is very difficult to fight against is that it's all happening in the context of war. Endless war, in fact. War that has been going on for more than a decade now with no end in sight in multiple countries around the world. And the reason that's so significant in terms of why this has happened is twofold. One is that war is always the time when rulers can assert power with the least amount of restraint. War itself is something that exists without really any law. On a battlefield, there's virtually no law. You shoot other people without charging them with the crime. You don't give them due process. They don't have lawyers. People who wield political power and who govern and who prosecute wars can essentially decide whatever they want to do without any restraints. And what our government has done under two administrations is assert the theory that war is not confined to any one particular physical space, but the entire world is a battlefield. So that everywhere the president exists, everywhere he asserts power, should be given this generosity of war, that there should be no limits on what he can do. And the other aspect of war, probably the more important tactic, is that the premier tactic of a government when it is at war, especially a prolonged war, is dehumanization. It has to dehumanize the group that is the target of the violence, because no citizenry, other than the most sociopathic, would tolerate continuous violence aimed at one group unless that group's humanity is denied. If it's rendered invisible, if they're equated to subhumans or continuously equated to people who are guilty and therefore deserve violence. And so once you have the sustained campaign of dehumanization that war brings, it basically means that the citizenry will think that whatever you want to do to that group is not only something we can tolerate, but is probably something that is justifiable and necessary. It is a psychological tool that changes the way that people think. It's the reason why war not only brings violence to foreign citizenries that we're targeting, but also degrades our own citizenry as well, really undermines and changes our national character in a way that makes it very difficult to get people to think that these abuses are worth stopping. The third reason why I think this is happening so relentlessly is because of partisan allegiance and the way that partisan allegiance can very effectively convert what was once perceived as radicalism into bipartisan consensus. There's this amazing report actually, done by the CIA. It was prepared by the CIA in 2008, and it was declared top secret. And it was ultimately leaked to WikiLeaks in 2009, which then published it. And it's a really amazing report. You can go and read it. And what prompted it was the concerns on the part of the CIA that spreading throughout Western Europe was this intense anti-war mentality, that governments in Western Europe were starting to fall because of their insistence on continuing to fight in Afghanistan against the will of the population. And the CIA was petrified that if this anti-war mentality spread any further, additional governments would fall. It would put pressure on Western European governments to withdraw from Afghanistan and eventually even compel the US government to do so as well. And what this report talked about, it was prepared in the middle of the general election season in 2008, was that the greatest hope the CIA had for stemming the tide of this anti-war movement spreading throughout Western Europe, threatening to come to the United States, was the election of Barack Obama. And the reason was that if Obama was elected, he would replace George Bush, who the world had come to despise, at least the parts of the world they were worried about. These war policies would no longer be represented by this swaggering unilateralist cowboy, but instead would have a much prettier, softer, progressive constitutional law face, which was beloved by Western Europe and large parts of the United States, and therefore this war would take on a much more humanitarian tone and would generate a lot more support, which is exactly what has happened. Not just in the context of American militarism, but civil liberties abuses as well. I know this from my own experience, as Jack alluded to. I know that, for example, 3 or 4 years ago, if I stood up in a room like this of, say, randomly assembled citizens, of, say, 200 citizens, and talked about the things I'm talking about tonight and condemned the policies that I'm condemning, half of the room, 50% of the room, would be incredibly hostile to my message, would really have a lot of hostility toward what I was saying. Those people were called Republicans. But 50% of the room, the other 50%, would be incredibly supportive. They would cheer. They would say, you're defending the Constitution. You're condemning all these horrible policies that are shredding the Constitution and waging war on American values. Those people were called Democrats. But 3 years later, if we were to assemble that same exact group of citizens in the same room and I were to stand up and condemn the exact same policies, 85% or 90% of the room would hate me. Maybe 80% if I were lucky, and 10 or 15 or 20% would be supportive because these policies under President Obama no longer are deemed the province of right-wing radicalism. They are now bipartisan consensus. There's some really interesting scholarship done by Jack Balkin, who's a law professor at Yale, on how policies, once they become the policies of both political parties, become immune from challenge and criticism. And he looks at historical examples when the Republicans were devoted to destroying what they considered to be the socialist agenda of FDR and the New Deal, and yet the first Republican president elected after Roosevelt was Dwight Eisenhower. He tinkered with the New Deal on the margins at most, and it became a permanent fixture of America's political landscape. And the same thing happened when the Goldwater conservatives of the 60s were devoted to uprooting the Great Society reforms of Lyndon Johnson, and yet the first Republican president they elected, Richard Nixon, was actually fairly liberal in a domestic realm, expanded a lot of these programs, and it was therefore removed from the realm of debate. That is exactly what has happened to the policies that only 3 and 4 years ago Democrats and progressives were running around madly denouncing as the root of all evil and extreme Republican radicalism. They have now become the policy of both parties and therefore are immune from challenge. Before I came over here, I was watching, I had the misfortune because I'm traveling, of watching the horror show known as MSNBC. And there was, outside of the debate, which was taking place, they had assembled a whole bunch of MSNBC watchers, and they were all waving big Obama signs and lean forward and forward, or whatever their slogans are. And Chris Matthews was interviewing the people in the crowd, and he was saying, what do you hope is asked of President Obama tonight? What would you ask him? And the first person said, I would ask him I would ask Mitt Romney why he's waging this horrible war on women and wants to take away the liberty of women. And everyone, he cheered, and we're so happy. And then the next one said, I would ask Mitt Romney why he wants to destroy the middle class and kill all the poor people and ruin everything for everyone except his rich friends. And the crowd erupted in cheers. And then the third person said, I would ask President Obama, I'm hoping to have President Obama asked about drones. And this intense silence fell over the crowd. I mean, it was like they were paralyzed. And then Chris Matthews said, well, what's your position on that? And he said, well, I don't think we should be murdering innocent foreign people with our weapons. And just this pall of depression and horror set in on the crowd. And actually, I thought about it, and I realized that, in fact, the MSNBC audience was probably shocked because this was the first time that they had actually heard that we're killing innocent people with our drones, because they watch MSNBC all the time, which never has mentioned any of this and never has told them about it. But that really is what the age of Obama has done in the conversion of these policies into bipartisan consensus. It's really extraordinary if you compare the controversies of the Bush administration and what made progressives and Democrats and liberals run around with such anger and rage in defense of the Constitution. It was things like Bush's claimed authority to imprison people, including American citizens, without due process, or his claimed power to eavesdrop on our conversations without first going to a court and obtaining judicial review. These were the things that Democrats 3 years ago and 4 years ago were depicting as the end of the republic imminently. And yet here you have, just a couple of years later, a president who is not only asserting the power to detain us without due process, although he is doing that, or the power simply to eavesdrop on our conversations without first obtaining judicial review, though he's doing that too, but also the power to target us for assassination, to kill American citizens, a power that he asserts not only in theory, but is exercised in practice when he targeted for death and then killed the American Yemeni cleric Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen, and then 2 weeks later killed his 16-year-old son, Abdul Rahman. And so what you see is this conversion of a whole group of the citizenry that just a few short years ago were willing to resist this, that view these policies as controversial, who are now completely on board with them. And so I think when you put all these factors together, you start to get a picture for why civil liberties erosions have not only sort of been allowed to remain the same, but have actually worsened the further we move away from the precipitating event, the pretense, which was 9/11. So the last thing I just want to say is, usually when I stand up and I talk about these things, I like to spend some time talking about what it is that can be done about all these things, because otherwise, if you don't, there's this danger that you can kind of infect everybody with this really like dark gloominess, like, oh my God, I just listened to this person talk for, a few minutes about all the horrible things that we're facing, and I just want to run home and shut all my doors and close the windows and just forget about it all, or jump off a bridge or something. And there's lots of reasons why that is a really irrational reaction, why that reaction is completely unwarranted. So I've chosen to sort of put that to the side, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in the Q&A session that follows. But I do want to note that despite how formidable these challenges are, and they are, and despite how sort of depressing they can be if you focus on them to the exclusion of solutions, which they can be, it always is the case that any structures that are built by human beings can be torn down and modified and replaced by other human beings if the right methods are found, if the right commitment and passion is devoted to that project. So there's really no reason to have sort of a resignation or defeatism. Quite the opposite. Focusing on these travesties should embolden all of us to just redouble our efforts to find the right solution to changing them. So with that, I thank you very much and look forward to talking more in the Q&A session.
Our next speaker this evening represents what would be called the right or conservative perspective on civil liberties, at least his conservative perspective on civil liberties. Bruce Fine graduated from Harvard Law School with honors in 1972. After a coveted federal judicial clerkship, he joined the U.S. Department of Justice, where he served as Assistant Director of Office of Legal Policy, Legal Advisor to the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust, and the Associate Deputy Attorney General. He has authored several volumes on the United States Supreme Court, the U.S. Constitution, and international law, and his book, American Empire Before the Fall, is one of the best outlines of where we are in our foreign policy, the loss of these civil liberties, and the attacks on the Constitution that you will find. I highly recommend it. Ladies and gentlemen, Bruce Fine.
I think there's a paradox that we confront in the United States today, and part of it is revealed by the variegated assemblage here this evening. You've heard a lot about the gloom, which I will reinforce, since I have to confront the invertebrate branch regularly in the Congress of the United States, and surrendered all of the power to executive branch quite willingly in order to display the maximum cowardice at evading every responsible, difficult judgment that needs to be made. But here I look at the audience. You all would not be, the women, those who are racial or other minorities, you wouldn't have the opportunity that you had unless in some sense the government had not intervened. Those who fought at Cemetery Ridge, those who were at Selma, Alabama, fighting the water hoses, the cattle prods, used to prevent people from voting, the Voting Rights Act. So in that sense, the civil liberties have expanded. And of course, we needed the government. The Voting Rights Act was indispensable to enabling the franchise to come about. And we should not ignore those things as we assess where we're going as a country today. So we have more people, if you will, who are in the club. They have equal rights under the law, which is a laudatory thing. Our forefathers had a legacy of slavery that was enshrined in the Constitution. So they had their flaws as well. We needn't go into all of them, the worst probably being the Fugitive Slave Act, which was sort of the predecessor of our National Defense Authorization Act. But what the club does is what has caused the reason for this particular convocation this evening. But I don't think we should be deceived into believing this is unique in the annals of human beings or even in the annals of the United States, because the United States itself has been blind to equally, I think, dangerous encroachments on civil liberties. If we just think about the so-called splendid World War II, it's supposed to be the greatest generation. Was it for the 120,000 Japanese Americans who were sent to concentration camps despite the absence of any evidence of sabotage or espionage 6 months after Pearl Harbor? Indeed, the United States had the disgrace to follow the Queen of Hearts and Alice in Wonderland through a General John DeWitt, who was sent to the West Coast by Franklin Roosevelt to survey the risk the Japanese Americans were creating to the United States by perhaps signaling Hirohito and others where they should bomb. After the 6-month survey, he had no evidence whatsoever of any untoward behavior. So he writes, "This is a very, very alarming, confirming indication that treason is afoot, because otherwise they would not have made it so difficult to uncover the incriminating evidence." Now, the knave is guilty because he didn't sign his name to the letter confessing he stole the tarts. I mean, and sending 120,000. Now, that wasn't the end of it, though. We also imposed the draft on the Japanese Americans serving in the concentration camps. Now, many of them had volunteered, indeed, ended up being the most medaled Air Force squadrons flying over Italy. But we prosecuted the handful of Japanese Americans, said, "You're asking me to fight for my serfdom and vassalage to you?" We didn't have any reluctance to do that because we were also complacent with the fact that the blacks serving in the armed forces were segregated. Couldn't drink at the same water fountains as whites, but hey, they're fighting for liberty, bro. Right? So this problem that we confront, times of war, is not unique today. Need to go back to Ecclesiastes. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. And I use that as a preface to making the observation that Tacitus made and applying it to present-day United States. He wrote, as the Roman Republic degenerated into the Roman Empire, "The worst crimes were dared by a few, willed by more, tolerated by all." And as the Weimar Republic in Germany after World War II degenerated into the Third Reich, same. Worst crimes dared by a few, willed by more, tolerated by all. The crimes of the government that have been enumerated today by Glenn and Jacob and Jack, same thing. Dared by a few, willed by more, and tolerated by all. And that simply is not acceptable if we wish to regain our status as a republic. I want to go back to even a more fundamental germ of our birth as a nation, to examine why it is we ought to be alarmed at where we are today. Now, when men and women first decided to move from a state of nature and organize political societies, there was a majority and a minority view of what the purpose of government was, of political association was. Now, the majority view was that people got together in order to aggrandize their military power so they could acquire additional territory, coerce other people, rob and plunder. And that was the majority view from the Old Testament onward. The minority view, and one that I think fueled the American Revolution, was that governments are formed from a state of nature with a social compact to create a society where men and women could be wise and magnanimous and knowledgeable and virtuous. That was the goal. The individual was the center of the national universe, not going abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And that's a very fundamental idea that separated the United States from every other nation in the world, even though at the outset we were 13 small states on the eastern seaboard with a tiny population and 6 frigates. But that idea was what Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote about in Concord Hymn. I have a prejudice since I was born in Cambridge for Concord Hymn. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flags to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world. And that was the shot that was heard and sent tremors throughout all of Europe and in Asia, where tyrants feared people would believe, hey, the purpose of this exercise, the social compact, isn't to aggrandize government authority, to enable them, like Julius Caesar, to say, I came, I saw, I conquered. But the purpose is to create and establish and secure the liberty of the individual, who would then be able to chart his or her own destiny, whatever it was. Overcome struggles. That was to be number one in the world. Not number one in the world in weapons, in military bases, in coercing other people, in arrogantly stating we're the ones who have angelic DNA and you have all Lucifer in your body, and therefore you should crave that we will come rescue you from your sinning. Can you imagine how insulting that seems to those who are abroad? Could you imagine walking into someone's living room and say, I'm superior to you. I'm coming to rescue you from your folly. And you should do what I tell you. You don't know what's really good for you and how dangerous it is not to worry about Taliban or Al-Qaeda or someone else. And if you look at our political culture today, it is what I would call it fluctuates between the adolescent and the infantile. And I say that, unfortunately, with great seriousness. I say I have to confront it every day in Congress. Because it's conceived as indistinguishable from a football game. Got one team, red team, blue team, whatever, everyone cheers, and the mental universe cannot get outside the concept that what's good for me is bad for the other guy. And all is preoccupied with, can I stay in power? It's not like adult politics is, hey, if we all hang together, we'll all hang separately. And the goal of politics is to make everybody a winner, to create a fair and even playing field so that everyone has a fair chance in life, to have a rule of law, and hope everybody wins. We don't gloat that somebody else loses or has a bad day. Oh, they made a gotcha moment. I mean, see, that's what we grew out of. 5 years old out of the sandbox. And that's the staple of political discourse. The Founding Fathers would be shocked. If you want to be very jarred to witness the total degradation of our political culture, in fact, it's so acute, it shakes confidence in Darwin's theory of evolution, right? Survival of the fittest. Read the annals of Congress, which recount the first debates over the creation of the judiciary and the First Bank of the United States and otherwise, and read the congressional record today. Those people at the outset were literate. They understood, they made allusions to historical events, the dangers of absolute power. And today, I mean, it's subliterate. Maybe it's subliterate. Anything beyond the polysyllabic way, that's going way too far. And to say this, not to be pedantic, but the mastery of politics is the most difficult discipline to master because it relates to curbing the human tendency to abuse absolute power, to crush people, to abuse them. And that's a difficult task to master. Indeed, most of the time it fails because the art of putting together separation of powers, of fragmenting power, to have a government strong enough to ensure the rule of law, but not so strong that it crushes liberty, is the most taxing and difficult in the history of mankind and why it generally fails. That's why you'll see after Arab Spring, everyone says, oh, by spontaneous combustion we'll have some new birth of freedom and liberty. No, you just have different tyrants to be the tyranny of the majority, which we're witnessing today in Libya, or we're witnessing in Iraq already. Egypt's the same. And does anyone believe that after spending $500 billion and all our soldiers in Afghanistan, we have now imparted to them the genius of political liberty? It's a complete joke. And if we don't grow up and acquire and practice adult politics, which again transcends this idea, Republican, Democrat, it's the values of who we are as a people. And it's focusing not so much as we are today, well, these are the bad guys, so we can't afford habeas corpus or due process. We don't do habeas corpus and due process because of them. We do it because what it says about us. We don't want to imprison someone without a fair hearing and trial. We don't want to permit the executive branch to detain without accusation or charge because it's a commentary on our values, not theirs. So this argument, well, the Saudis wouldn't give us these rights, or they would never afford our soldiers these rights. So what? That defines them as savages in many respects. We don't want to emulate them. It's our lives and credibility and values that are on the line. And we know what we believe in. It's as Abraham Lincoln said, "As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. As we would not be colonized, so we would not want to be colonizers." And we have lost that. And ladies and gentlemen, that was a conviction of the founding generation. It was captured perhaps most brilliantly by then Secretary of State John Quincy Adams in his July 4th, 1821 address to Congress. "We do not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy." He said, "We could be dictatress of the world, but our policy would slip from one of liberty and freedom to one of coercion and domination." And we rejected that, even if we could be dictatress of the world. The glory of a republic is liberty. The glory of an empire is conquest. And we chose a republic at the outset. And now we have turned that all on its head. We go to war unilaterally by the president in flagrant violation of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the Constitution. Perhaps the clearest provision, other than the 35-year-old requirement for eligibility for the presidency in the entire document. And Jay talked about standing armies. Half of the Constitutional Convention debates and the ratification debates were devoted to mechanisms to avoid and prevent standing armies, because it was the death knell for every previous republic in the history of mankind. And that's why the Army and Navy are uniquely limited by the Constitution to receiving appropriations only 2 years, so that Congress would be forced to revisit the wisdom of having a standing army at least every 2 years. And even the Second Amendment's right to bear arms in order to practice a well-regulated militia was designed to be a surrogate armed forces other than a standing army to protect us against actual attack. Now, with regard to the appropriations measure, we now have a Pentagon that can't even have its books audited. They're so disorganized. Donald Rumsfeld came and said, "Oh, the $2 to $3 trillion I can't even find." $2 to $3 trillion. Now, aside from that debacle, we now have one candidate for the president saying, even though the books can't be audited and he's a businessman, he wants to throw more money at it. New ships, $20 billion ship, 100,000 new troops. It costs us $1 million a day to have them in Afghanistan. I don't know what he's going to have them doing. I guess he doesn't believe we're in enough wars at present. So Somalia, Libya, Uganda, Mali, hell, you can find anywhere in the world. We already are picking up. You can see China is our next bugbear after we run out of terrorists to kill. South China Sea, we're defending Vietnam. After you go to the Vietnam War Memorial, why did those 56,000 people die? Now we're defending the enemy against China. And we're defending the Japanese claim to 5 rocky islands in the East China Sea, over China. What does this have to do with our national security? Nothing. I know we're trying to be succinct and leave opportunities for questions, so I will be conclusory here at the end, but I want to try to focus on an explanation that builds on Glenn's as to why is this happening? Why is the United States accepting the role of empire with very little, if any, resistance? Certainly Congress has not. It's not defended its prerogatives. It keeps ratcheting up the war powers and authorities and detention authorities of the president, even though there's not a single protester in all of the country who is going to the White House and saying, hey, we need to be protected better, give the president more power. None. No lobbyists claiming we needed to have the National Defense Authorization Act. And yet it passes anyway. And it's a little bit odd, too. It passes 11 years, 10, 11 years after 9/11, where the number of al-Qaeda, you can almost count on your hand with fingers left. And if you want to demonstrate, I think, how inflated the danger is compared to, say, the 17,000 homicides in the United States every year, year after year, I once calculated if you took the troop-to-enemy ratio towards al-Qaeda in Afghanistan today and applied that troop-to-enemy ratio in World War II, fighting the Germans and Japanese, we would have fielded an armed force of 3.5 billion soldiers. Right? We would have to multiply our entire population by 126 and conscripted every single one of them. And moreover, the Germans and the Japanese were highly sophisticated nations. V-1, V-2 rockets, Werner von Braun, they had great scientists, they had industrial complexes, they had organized ability to tax, compared to al-Qaeda, living in caves and whatever. 3.5 billion. So we accept this idea of empire in part because it does respond to what I call a degenerate element of human motivations that gets a thrill out of being a bully. To be candid, I mean, even if Osama bin Laden is killed, and he was a wretch, there's no doubt about it. He, in fact, was one of the few who was indicted, although they probably, according to somebody I know who was involved in the Navy SEAL team, they were told, don't attempt to capture him. We didn't want to bring him back for a trial. But putting that aside, it's a little bit ghoulish afterwards. I was near the White House. People jumping up, down, and clapping like the Super Bowl had been won. These are tragedies of life, and we don't want to celebrate someone who has been so wretched and cavalier in killing other people. But you don't clap and say, hey, this is great, we're number one. And that is sort of the savage instinct that drives this idea for empire. It's very primal. All these textbooks and academics who don't know anything about human nature, national security, well, we need to get oil, we need all sorts of alignments, we need allies and networks out there. That has nothing to do with this war. Who thinks that Croatia and NATO is going to come help us in a crisis where we're attacked? We dictate the whole thing. And with regard to natural resources, my gosh, you could bribe people with the amount of money we spend on the military, $1 trillion, to sell them the oil. Hugo Chavez, he's selling us everything he can find. The Iranians would sell us every drop of oil we'd have if we got an embargo against them. You can always bribe and corrupt foreign rulers with money, just as it works in the United States as well. Right? Follow the money. So what can this audience do? I mean, in some sense, I view us as collectively like Paul Revere, right? Just before the American Revolution. Again, since born where he was writing, I grew up, the first thing that I memorized and heard wasn't Justin Bieber or anything. It was William Henry Longfellow, listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. It was the 18th of April in 75, and barely a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. One if by land, two if by sea, and I at the opposite side shall be. Now, I was quite mortified when President Ford was running for re-election, and he thought the phrase was one if by day, two if by night. Said, Mr. President, did you pass your civics test? And then another candidate got Pearl Harbor Day wrong at September 7th, but we don't want to be too strict. No child left behind. Misspelling potato was secondary compared to these errors. Memory. We need to remember that all great changes have begun with, figuratively, at the bottom of Mount Everest. The ideas that you've heard today are jarring because you don't hear them anywhere, either in the mainstream media or basically in the college as well. In some sense, it's healthy that we're inclined to be patriotic and believe our country is great and good, and we ought to respect it. But there's nothing useful about respecting something that is deteriorated and degenerated. And we can't leave you with any Pollyannish view that an idea will take a light and burn like a firefighter, and we will have a republic if we wait another 2 or 3 or 4 years for the word to be spread. Because we have a huge military industrial terrorism complex to overcome. Probably the majority of the citizens who are working in the United States have some financial stake or a stake in prestige in keeping the empire intact. They sell weapons, they sell Transportation Security Administration, new screening devices. They're in the Pentagon and they go out and get consulting contracts, so they're all compromised about speaking the truth as to what in fact is happening in Afghanistan. And it's difficult to get somebody to understand a truth if their job depends upon not understanding it. Yeah. So in some sense, it's the youth that needs to be the ones who carry the torch forward and restore the American Republic. Irrespective of whether we succeed, in my judgment, it's the only path forward. For us, it's our finest hour, even if it goes totally unrecognized in the annals of history books. The very first person who stood up and said slavery was evil was destroyed, and we don't know who they were. We don't know who that person was. The very first woman, even prior to that brave young lady in Pakistan who stood up and said women shouldn't be subjugated, disappeared. We don't know who that was. We just know that someone at some time and place has to stand up and say it's wrong, and we need to change before we can possibly help to advance and honor the civilization that we inherited from the Founding Fathers. Thanks.
Okay, now we want to hear, now that we've heard our prestigious speakers, what you think. I think the best way to do this is maybe to line up at that microphone. If you have a question, and we'll take them one by one. You can direct them to individuals on the panel or the entire panel. Yes, sir.
Hi. You gentlemen, during your talks, made a point about due process. I'd like to say something about that, since you ask us the question what we can do. I've been around a while, as you can tell, and I remember the early attacks on due process were back in the 60s and 70s when I was in school and we were fighting against the Vietnam War. The results of that was a law passed in this state, the state of California. If I remember right, it's Civil Code Section 821.6, which states, and I got this pretty much down right, any government official in the state of California can institute any proceeding, judicial or administrative, and not be held accountable in a court of law, even if they act with malice and without probable cause. That vitiates the Fourth Amendment, because basically the Constitution says you need probable cause, and the state of California says, oh, we don't give a damn about that. Go ahead and do what you want, and we'll protect your ass. That law needs to be overturned. In this state, we have the initiative process. One of the reasons people are losing their liberty, one of the reasons the whole idea of democracy is falling apart in this country is because people don't know about laws like that, which undercut everything we believe in. If people would start an initiative process, since we do have the initiative in this state, to overturn that law.
What is your question, sir?
I'm answering their question. What can be done? I'm suggesting people work to overturn that law.
Your question is what can be done about due process in a practical manner.
Well, let me put it this way then. What do you people think of that law? Because I think it's horrible.
No, I think it's very clear that if there's a right without a remedy, it's rather hollow. But I would be surprised if it hadn't been challenged in the United States federal court system since its inception, since it's obviously an affront to the Fourth Amendment to immunize people who flout the provision.
Just before we get to the next question, I'm sure lots of people want to have questions. We're going to try to get as many as we can possible. So please just ask your questions. A little bit of background, but just not a complete statement. But go ahead.
Okay. Mine, quick background. one of the most important provisions debated in the Constitutional Convention was how many representatives should be in Congress. And it was fought quite a bit, almost as much as, in fact, perhaps even more than the three provisions you suggested. I believe that the reason we're in the hell that we're in is because we have 100 senators and 435 House members. George Washington said 30,000 was representation, 40,000 was tyranny. And the Anti-Federalists thought that was crazy because Montesquieu said no one should represent more than 5,000 people. We have not increased the U.S. House in 100 years. I think it was February 14th, 1912, when they froze the U.S. House at 435 members. The population's tripled. U.S. House districts went from 200 and some odd thousand, now there's 710,000 people. Congressmen have nothing in common with us. Rather than adding more representatives.
So is the question the ratio to population versus representation?
And what in the heck does that have to do with liberty? Because when you have 95% reelection rates, they're not getting run out. One of their most important duties was to investigate and inform and protect our civil liberties.
Okay.
It was
All
not
right.
supposed to be the courts.
Well, Jenny, you gentlemen want to comment on that?
Well, there was a comment that James Madison made in Federalist 55 that even if every Athenian citizen was a Socrates, a collective of them all would still be a mob. There comes a point at which you have such a great number that discourse becomes impossible. You know, I have 1,000, 2,000. And moreover, if you're trying to suggest that numbers are what count, take an examination of the United States Senate, that by the Constitution is fixed at 2 senators per state. I'm up there all the time, and I see very little to distinguish the deliberations of the Senate as opposed to deliberations of the House, other than that there's more narcissism in the Senate side. But the result is basically the same. Now, with regard to the re-election, that's the districting process, and I do commend places like California, Charlie Munger, who has now got a nonpartisan commission, who's drawing the line so that the re-election of the incumbents becomes less certain. But I think that's a fair worry that the Founding Fathers had, that too great a numbers, you got thousands there, impairs the deliberative process.
You know, let me follow up and maybe incorporate the point that you were making. Is that I think we need to constantly bear in mind the fundamental principles here of what is the nature of government and how does the government relate to us? What's our relationship as citizens to the government? And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people opposed calling the federal government into existence. And why is that? Because they understood that the greatest threat to their freedom and to their well-being lay with the government. And it existed also at the state level. So when states do these things like you were talking about, that shouldn't surprise us. Because that's the nature of government, to expand its power over citizens. And structurally, the Constitution was designed to protect us. So you had this interesting situation where you're calling the government into existence to protect liberty, but at the same time, it's the greatest threat to our liberty. And I think we should stay focused on that. Is it how do we regain this proper sense of balance, recognizing that the government at all levels, state level, federal level, is going to do these things? How do we structurally and spiritually and morally and so forth put things back into a proper balance? How do we protect ourselves from those that are supposedly designed to protect us?
Yeah, but I think to add to what you said, Jacob, the destruction of separation of powers is what the Founding Fathers couldn't have conceived, because Congress was supposed to be the check upon the executive branch. After all, the revolt against Britain was a revolt against the tyrannies of King George III. It was his grievances that were enumerated in the Declaration of Independence. And the separation of powers is now, with empire, is totally disintegrated. Congress doesn't conduct oversight. They surrender willingly their power to the president. That's why, I repeat, they're the invertebrate branch, and they don't want to assert their prerogatives. In part, that's become the partisanship is so pronounced, the members are more loyal to the Republican or Democratic Party than they are to the institution itself. So the president knows he's got half of Congress with him no matter what kind of usurpation is undertaken, because he's he's either Republican or Democrat. And that can change only if the voters insist that the members of Congress exercise their prerogatives. Working with a candidate out in Michigan 11th District, and he's actually got now the fortitude to say, if you elect me, I will decide whether we go to war or not. It's not the president. I will have access to the information, and that's what has to happen if we're going to restore the balance you've spoken about.
Yes, sir.
Yes, wonderful ideas put around. Very good information. Thank you for being here. This is super. And I brought my son here. I have a Jewish background, and so when you start mentioning genocide or people groups being dehumanized, I come from a long line of annihilated people, and but it made perfect sense when you have to dehumanize, and I see systematically we've done that. So it's more of a statement, also, and a question. In bringing the abortion deal into it, we're missing half of America's missing surgically and chemically. We've exterminated our own people. So can that, on the base level, continue on without a morality or golly, I'm sorry.
Are you asking a question about abortion?
Yeah.
I'm going to have to skip that one. We're trying to stick to civil liberties and the war on terror and all that, and that's sort of not something we want to discuss in this.
Well, it's the liberties of a people group that
Right.
that we said is not a human all the way to 9 months.
Liberties for women to have autonomy over their bodies.
Right. See, this is getting into a debate that we're not really supposed to be having here. So, right. We're talking about civil liberties and the war on terror.
It's murder. So
Hey, we all have
okay.
opinions on it, believe me, but this is just not the time and place. But I appreciate your question. Yes, sir.
All right, I want to thank you guys for coming. I kind of know some of your stance on impeachment, but I want to raise it because it is the most significant check of the legislative branch on the executive. I can say personally I worked for Cheney's impeachment for 6 years, and it was only when he shot his friend in the face that even basic liberals be willing to speak out publicly on the streets of America. So the cowardice was even there for a long time. And for the same with Obama, I mean, obviously the impeachment list is long and wide, and that should be called for even up to the current day, just practically because he's the most impeachable president we've ever seen. Obviously with the threats of war right now, you mentioned China, there's obviously Russia. There was reference to the nuclear winter after the Arab Spring with Syria. Obviously, there's engrossed threats, not only to our country, but globally at this time. So that's the background. The question is, to what extent do you think that the actual economic destructions of the country over the course of decades, and then currently now the hyperinflation that we see financially, but more so the long-term economic destruction, how is that playing a role in the acceptance of the destruction of civil liberties and the tolerance of these kinds of constitutional breaches?
So I'll address that in a couple ways. One is that, obviously if you look toward Western Europe and places where we always thought that there'd be great stability, you see all kinds of instability and great citizenry dissatisfaction, marches in the street, people obviously so dissatisfied that they want to bring disorder and disruption to their own society. And if you look at what planners in the United States government and related institutions are thinking about, they are anticipating that kind of disorder and disruption will come to the United States as well. It's virtually inevitable if this economic path continues, and I don't think anybody really believes that it won't. Eventually there will be great anxiety, economic distress, and therefore social disorder as well. And I think a big part of why these civil liberties theories are being imported from what was the war on terror, from being exercised outside of the United States into the domestic realm. And that's really what you see more than anything. I mean, if you look at national security officials, 10 years ago, they were talking about Al-Qaeda as the greatest national security threat. If you ask them now, they say the greatest national security threat is what they call homegrown terrorism. And so all of the civil liberties abuses of the last several years have been focused on not foreign nationals but American citizens, not foreign soil but domestic soil. So the National Defense Authorization Act to allow indefinite detention to be brought to American soil, targeting American citizens for assassination, all the FBI efforts to create this right to entrap people, to engage in surveillance, all domestically. And I think it's really in anticipation of what will likely be economic caused disruption, disorder, protest in the United States, and the way that the elite class thinks they'll handle that is by consolidating these powers now, by justifying them in the name of terrorism, then by importing them into the domestic realm and then using them against not foreign terrorists, but against the American population. And you see lots of those tactics used against the Occupy movement, used against other dissident groups in the United States. Obviously, there was a well-known and notorious case here just a year ago that to me was sort of an expression of the same notion, which is the idea that if people are peacefully assembling but doing so in a way that's threatening to those in power, there will be this use of massive force, which would include not only things like pepper spray, but also detention, mass incarceration, denial of due process, surveillance as a way of pacifying the citizenry and getting control. And I very much think that that is part of the long-term plan. It's not the idea that the government fears Islamic radicals. That's the pretext. What they fear more than anything, I think, is a mass movement inside the United States that can subvert the prevailing power order, that will take place far away from the ballot box where they're comfortable having us, and will take place in the street as well. And so I think a lot of this is about trying to anticipate and plan for how those kinds of disruptions and protest movements will be addressed.
I don't think, however, that there is a correlation between the willingness to surrender liberty in exchange for safety and economic well-being. If the unemployment rate fell in the next year to 4%, I do not think Congress will repeal the Patriot Act. I don't think they'd repeal the NDAA. I think presidents will still claim they had the authority to assassinate Americans without any due process. I think they would remain totally undisturbed. And the initial encroachments on liberty in the name of safety began well before there was any downturn in the economy. I think they run on different rails.
Well, let me just add one thing to that, which is I do think, though, I agree with what Bruce said, but I do think there's a relationship between economic anxiety and the ability to get the population to be more invested in these kind of jingoistic appeals. When people perceive that their own country is economically on the decline, that they're on the decline in other forms of prestige, I think they're more vulnerable to appeals to these kind of base and savage instincts that Bruce talked about. It really struck me when Obama announced the killing of Osama bin Laden. In the middle of his speech, he had this passage that was so bizarre to me when I first read it, which was, he said, "This is a testament, yet another example in America's long line of examples that is a testament to our national greatness, to the idea that when we set our mind to do something, we can go about and do it." And the reason that was so remarkable is because that's always been the language used to commemorate things like sending somebody to the moon or inventing a new technology that employed tons of people or discovering a cure for a horrible disease. And yet now we're basically at the point where the only form of national celebration and national self-esteem collectively that we can find is our ability to go hunt somebody down who's hiding somewhere, pump a bunch of bullets into their skull while they're unarmed, and then dump their corpse into the ocean. And this was also something you saw at the Democratic National Convention. Every time bin Laden's corpse was paraded around, the crowd erupted in these really creepy chants of USA, USA. Like this was our crowning national jewel at this point. And I think a big part of that is because when people perceive that there's economic anxiety and there's lots of economic suffering, scapegoats are much more easily created, and they're much more easily led to believe that violence done in their name is something that they should take pride in because there's so few other ways to get them to feel this collective pride. So I think they're related in that regard.
I think there's another dimension here that you may have been intimating that we need to focus on, and that is that all of these measures that we're talking about here with respect to the terrorist crisis, it's very possible that those powers can be applied in an economic emergency. Look at what Roosevelt did during the New Deal. I mean, he nationalizes gold. He confiscates everybody's gold. This had been the official money of the United States for more than 100 years, and he makes it a felony offense to be caught owning gold, and they prosecuted people criminally for owning gold. And if you look, for example, in Chile under Allende, they had their own 9/11. On 9/11 was when Pinochet took power in a coup and exercised these powers that Glenn and Bruce are talking about and that I've talked about, that rounding up people that were communists and terrorists, people who had served in the Allende regime, rounded them up, tortured them, executed them, raped them. 3,000 people were just executed without trials. Why? Not because of a terrorist attack, but because of an economic emergency. And an emergency that had been brought about in part by the CIA when Nixon had said, make that economy scream. And when we see this happening, out of control federal spending, in large part because of military spending, they're spending more than $1 trillion a year in excess of the tax revenues. When you see us headed toward that situation with Greece, where there's going to be possibly massive economic chaos, where they might even be talking about confiscating 401ks to finance their deficit like they did in Argentina. All of a sudden, you're talking about some serious economic crises that are oftentimes used to exercise these kind of dictatorial powers.
Yeah. Now, the questioner did ask about impeachment, and I'll respond because I actually drafted articles of impeachment against Mr. Bush and Mr. Obama, both. You can read about them. They're published online. We're trying to get them introduced probably in the lame duck session, at least as regards to Mr. Obama. And Ben Franklin explained at the Constitutional Convention that impeachment was a substitute for assassination. It's the most civilized way in which you punish an abuse of power. It was to sanction crimes against the Constitution. Now, Ben and the Founding Fathers didn't anticipate Nancy Pelosi stating in 2006 that, quote, impeachment is off the table. I guess maybe the First Amendment's off the table too, or whatever else. She's not someone who is highly literate in the Constitution. When she was asked what was the authority to pass what even Obama now calls Obamacare, all her response was, "Are you kidding? You know, we have a Constitution." But the problem is not that we don't have the institutional mechanisms to rein in executive abuses. It's that there's no political will to do any of it. And until you, again, do a surgical implant of a vertebrae in the Congress, it's not going to happen.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, my question's more on civil liberties and how we can, other ways we can fight for freeing ourselves against our government or against some of the breaches of the Constitution. During the inception of America, there were some tools that we don't really have anymore, like state nullification, that you don't really see anymore, but was used up until the 1850s, where the North was nullifying the
Fugitive Slave Act.
Yes, thank you. The Fugitive Slave Act to stop. Just they won't help the government do that. And so I'm wondering what other unconventional tools that maybe we don't know about that we as states or as just people can help to work together to stop these sorts of things, other than things like voting and impeachment.
Well, the first is the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that were passed in opposition to the Alien Sedition Acts of 1798. They are at least a reflection of the voice of, at least Virginia was a powerful state then, not so much Kentucky, complaining against what was said to be a violation of the First Amendment and due process. The Alien Sedition Act was not continued, expired at the end of John Adams' term, unlike our infamous Patriot Act that keeps getting extended more and more for more and more years with fewer and fewer opposition votes as the years elapse and its futility continues to become more apparent. But those are things that state legislatures can do, pass resolutions urging that Congress do X, Y, and Z. Now, there obviously, if something became extreme, there is an alternate method than the one that's been used throughout the U.S. history of amending the Constitution. One method is for the Congress by 2/3 votes to propose an amendment to the states that then need 3/4 states to ratify in order to become an amendment. But the second that's not been utilized is have 2/3 of the state legislatures petition for a constitutional convention, which could then draft various proposed amendments which would then be resubmitted to the states. The latter perhaps is most useful, simply the educational mission. At one time you had almost the 2/3 calling for a convention to consider a balanced budget amendment, so we weren't saddling posterity with the staggering sums that we do today. And the fact that you would have a debate on the issue or focus sunshine on a major problem would be a very helpful thing, even if amendment was never in fact ratified.
I would add to that, too, just a recent example. We saw the state of Texas a number of years ago under Governor Rick Perry try to kick out the TSA, which is an assault on the Constitution every time you travel. So maybe there are states' rights ways of resisting these sorts of things. But I really hope your question is just your T-shirt. I think that would be great. But in the interest of sticking to the subject at hand, what's your question, sir?
Can you describe any examples anywhere in the world where there have been substantial restorations of civil liberties without revolution and without a foreign conquering power?
I think that the answer is probably no, but the real question is what is meant by revolution. I think a lot of times whenever this discussion arises, it gets dichotomized. Like you can either kind of passively go about law-abiding methods of trying to do change, which is going to the ballot box, writing to your members of Congress, all of those things that the powers that be want us to do because they're completely inconsequential. Or then the other dichotomy, the other end of that dichotomy is take to the street in violent revolution. And I think more often than not, the solution really lies in terms of viewing this as a continuum. So there's lots of different ways that you can engage in civil disobedience, that you can use the force of disruption to bring about real change without some sort of violent revolution. I mean, you look to American history, and there really are lots of genuine and very significant examples of civil liberties being institutionalized without some sort of violent revolution. Obviously, when the country began, black people in this country were owned as slaves, and now one is sitting in the Oval Office. We have all kinds of legislation designed to rectify all of those wrongs. The same is true for women. The same is true for gay Americans. Lots of different people in the society have been able to combat injustices, not by going to the ballot box and confining yourself to voting, but by finding ways to use that passion to engage in kind of something short of real revolution, but that things that are very effective. I think you see the same thing in the Arab Spring. What happened in the Arab Spring were not full-scale revolutions in the sense that the palaces were stormed and the leaders were shot. It's just that the public found ways to express their dissatisfaction to such an extent that essentially the leadership crumbled. So yeah, I do think that you have to find creative ways to operate outside of the narrow confines that people in power like to provide to those whose rights are being abused as a way of sort of placating them and saying, here, go do this whenever you're angry and no one will listen, sort of like, oh, if you don't like it, there's the complaint box over there, sort of the metaphor, that's what that is. So you definitely want to always look for ways outside of that. But I think you've seen examples even recently, whether it's the Tea Party movement, at least in its original incarnation, before it kind of got exploited and annexed by the Republican Party. I think the Occupy movement was that. I think things like WikiLeaks and Bradley Manning, who just sort of on their own found ways to place real fear in the heart of the national security threat, blow a big hole in the wall of secrecy. What Anonymous is doing, what people who are working on internet anonymity are doing to enable us to work on the internet without the arm of the government surveillance state reaching us. These are all ways that are serious and substantial, but that are not necessarily the sort of classic case of violent revolution, which isn't to say that revolution is an option that should be decreed off limits in your own head or in any other sense. But I think there's lots of other stages between just passive acquiescence and full-scale violent revolution that have proven historically and are proven currently to be quite effective in restoring lots of these liberties.
I think that there is an example in the United States, and I lived through it. It's called Watergate and its aftermath. That was my baptism in Washington. My first assignment in the Office of Legal Counsel was write a monograph on what was an impeachable offense for a president that hadn't been considered for a century. And what happened in Watergate was that the American people, and finally Congress at the behest of the American people, said, no, the president can't make it legal just by doing it. And the Watergate hearings, the fact that you had people who quit and insisted on being fired by President Nixon because their oath was to the Constitution. Archibald Cox, who was a teacher of mine at Harvard Law School, Elliot Richardson, William Ruckelshaus, the special prosecutor force that stayed on and said, even if you're president, you're subject to the criminal law. The arguments in the U.S. Supreme Court, a unanimous decision. The President of the United States at one point said he was going to defy the court, and there were 2 million telegrams, not emails, telegrams, saying you really shouldn't do that, you'll be impeached. Articles of impeachment were voted. He resigned under a cloud. I can still vividly see in my mind right now that helicopter said, hey, I'm an American. That's the most proud moment I had of being an American. The most powerful man in the entire world is still subject to the law. The law is king here. And right after, and in that time, it was the Congress did passed War Powers Resolution. It's been now honored in the breach rather than the observance. Congress did hold hearings, serious hearings on the CIA, despite all the claims like on Afghanistan. Well, the sky is falling. We'll never, ever again have any CIA because no one will confide in us. The Church Committee hearings did result in the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the crown jewels, the family jewels. William Colby disclosed 2 decades worth of crimes by the CIA. And we did have an example of a time when it was bipartisan support for rectifying the abuses of the executive branch that had really grown up ever since World War II. Now, it's unfortunate that slowly thereafter that all frittered away, and now these laws are sort of, in Alberto Gonzalez's words, rather quaint. So they're more treated like wallpaper than as real limits on the executive branch. But that shows that it happened in the United States, and it happened because the American people were engaged. And in Watergate, they were not paying attention to American Idol. They were watching John Dean and John Mitchell and John Ehrlichman testify, and they were watching the impeachment hearings. And if that happened again, then I think there's a chance that we don't need to do anything radical in order to bring our politicians to account.
We also shouldn't forget one of the big examples. When I was growing up, I was told that there was no possibility that we'd ever see the Soviet Union dismantled peacefully, because the Soviet Union had all the guns, and the citizens were not permitted to own guns. Therefore, there was no chance of violent revolution. And yet, 1989 comes along, and the whole thing comes dismantled. The Berlin Wall comes crashing down. This was all done peacefully. No violence at all, just through the power of ideas. And keep in mind that there's a reason why totalitarian dictatorships try to shut meetings like this down, because they understand the power of ideas. Why should the Chinese government be concerned about a meeting like this? Why would they try to shut it down? Because they know that there's something that happens. There's a synergy that takes place when people get together and start discussing ideas on liberty. It's a force that's immeasurable. And there may not be an overarching central plan for restoring freedom to our land, but just through the percolation of ideas, what we're doing right here, there's something that takes place here that all of a sudden starts transcending, sending waves out that can manifest itself in a result that none of us plans, that all of a sudden just comes to the surface, and people say, where the heck did that come from? Well, it comes from thousands and thousands of meetings like this across the land.
Yes, sir.
I'm just going to pull up my question. Sorry. This is directed to Mr. Fine. I really enjoyed your speech, and you quoted one of my favorite poems about Longfellow. You also talked about the degradation of our Constitution, the war in Afghanistan, and the American values of our forefathers. You even quoted John Quincy Adams and noted the military-industrial complex. As you may or may not know, there are key bases that make the war on terror until this day possible, and they're located in Turkey, Adana. Mr. Fine, would you please explain your work as an active lobbyist in numerous Turkish lobbying organizations?
I've never done any lobbying work whatsoever, so I don't have anything to explain. I've handled a couple lawsuits concerning freedom of speech.
Thank you.
Okay, next question.
I wanted to bring the conversation more domestically and talk about the events of last November 18th and the pepper spray incident, because I feel like it was a huge attack on our civil liberties. And, I wasn't involved in the pepper spray incident at all.
Was this an incident here at the university?
The UC Davis pepper spray incident. I don't know how familiar you are about that incident.
Oh, yeah, okay.
But are you familiar?
Yeah, I read about it. I think we're all aware of it.
It made national news.
Created a lot of havoc for the president of the university.
Recently, last July, it was leaked that the police department felt like nothing wrong happened. They felt like Lieutenant Pike shouldn't be fired or barely punished. And I was hoping that you could share your thoughts about the shockingly little amount of reform that's taken place since that incident.
I mean, I wrote actually a lot about that incident because I thought it was just such a microcosm of so many different things. So, like I said a little bit earlier, I think the real symbolic meaning of that incident was that here you had a bunch of students who were, and this is the reason it was just so kind of remarkable to people, was because here you had a bunch of students who were obviously peacefully assembling, engaged in the kind of political activism that you would want college students to be engaging in, and here you had this completely sadistic, vindictive, police presence who just decided for purely kind of savage reasons to just spray this chemical onto a bunch of people who were just sitting there. And the reason why that shocked people is because it was on video and it was just so gratuitous, but this is the kind of thing that happens continuously. It's just not usually captured on video in such a graphic way. And I think two things are notable about it. One is what I said earlier, which is that there's a deliberate effort on the part of federal, state, and local police in the United States, which has become paramilitarized in the wake of 9/11 with huge budgets, to essentially coordinate this effort, this planned strategy that in the wake of any kind of peaceful assembly that is significant in any way, to use a massive showing of force as a means of intimidating and deterring people from exercising their constitutional rights. So it's a much more effective form of tyranny to basically intimidate a population out of exercising their rights than it is to explicitly revoke those rights by just decreeing that they no longer exist. I know during that whole Occupy couple months, I was traveling the country for my book tour, and everywhere I would go, I would hear from people saying, I really support the Occupy movement, but my concern is that they're, pepper spraying people, they're arresting people, people were being severely injured by tear gas canisters and the like, and they basically intimidated and deterred people from going, and the police actually won that battle nationwide, and this was sort of a microcosm of it. This is a way of trying to create this climate of fear where people don't exercise their own constitutional rights, they voluntarily relinquish them. The other thing I would say is this idea, I mean, it was so obvious that the chancellor and the people responsible more directly were not going to suffer any repercussions. And if you, to know that, all you have to do is look at what has happened in this country in the last decade, where you saw the most egregious crimes committed, the institution of a worldwide torture regime, spying on American citizens without the warrants required by the law that Bruce just mentioned, which was the FISA law, massive systemic fraud on the part of Wall Street that collapsed the world economy, causing great suffering to this day, persisting of hundreds of millions of people. None of this led to any accountability of any kind. These are the most egregious crimes you can imagine, committed by the country's most powerful actors, because we have this idea that those who exercise the greatest power are immunized from accountability even when they commit egregious crimes. And this is just a kind of manifestation of that same mindset, but on a local level, where the authorities who exercise power are doing so in the name of some sort of claimed good, and therefore even when they transgress the limits of their power, the worst that happens is they suffer some recriminations in terms of criticism and the like, but they keep their jobs, they hang on to their power, they suffer no damage to their career, to their position, to the assertion of their authority. And it's this immunity, because as Bruce said earlier, if you have mandates with no punishment for violating it, the mandates become worthless. And that's essentially what we've done. We've said people who exercise power in the United States are immunized from punishment even for egregious violations. And what's amazing about that is at the very same time we've said that, we've created this national, intense, sprawling penal state where we imprison more of our ordinary citizens than any other country in the world for more trivial offenses, for longer periods of time. And so you have this completely disparate system of justice for people who exercise power where they're immune from punishment, and then people who are ordinary and have no power who are routinely punished even for trivial transgressions like drug possession and the like. And this is a major part of everything that we're talking about tonight, this climate of fear combined with the idea that if you exercise power, you have no reason to adhere to any limits. And the pepper spraying incident sort of conveyed all of that in really vivid ways caught on video.
Okay, we're getting close to time, but I think we have enough time for everybody in line. We got 6 people, 6 questions, and it'll end with that young lady right there, but we'll get all 6 of you. So
I'll keep it short. First of all, I read all you guys all the time. Your book, The American Empire Before the Fall, I've given it to 6 or 7 different people and completely changed their political perspective. I'd like to know a distinction on how you guys view civil liberties. Like I would say, like Jacob being a libertarian, he has a non-aggression axiom, and just how do you view what is a civil liberty, each individual?
I think that's a great question.
Well, I consider civil liberties part of the overall conception of why we came together and formed the nation. The Declaration of Independence says the purpose of government, I read, the purpose is to secure rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And that when a government becomes destructive of those ends and is an earmark of tyranny, you have not only a right, a duty to overthrow it. So my view is that liberty and choice is the default position of every individual. No one has to wake up and defend their right to choose to live their own life the way they wish. It's inherent in breathing. The government is the one that shouldered with the burden, in my view, of coming forth with very strong empirical evidence that a very, very urgent public interest is involved in trying to curtail that liberty. The burden of proof is always on the government. That's why you see the current circumstances turns that on its head. Even after over 10 years of the Patriot Act, and I was testifying against reauthorization, I said, you don't have any evidence that even one terrorist act has been foiled by any of these new authorities. The deputy head of the counterterrorism force in New York City said all the cases that were cracked, they could have used pre-Patriot Act authorities. So that the assumption was, well, if it's conceivable that sometime in the next century, this authority might possibly be utilized to thwart an attack, okay, let's give them the authority. That's a total misunderstanding of what I conceive to be the balance of liberty as opposed to government authority.
Okay. Next. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jacob.
I think everybody here would understand that there's philosophical differences between the three of us, possibly, well, certainly on economics, role of government in society, but on civil liberties, we might encompass the First Amendment. Oftentimes, people refer the First Amendment as part of the civil liberties. But when I think about civil liberties, is when we talk about the power of government to just go out and seize a person. We might disagree on gun control, for example, too. But the reason that I said at the very beginning that this is the most important burning issue of our time is because it is the ultimate power of a government. The power of a government to just come and grab you and take you away in the dark of night and never be heard from again. I mean, there's no greater power than that. The power to seize your guns, the power to take your money away, to seize your income, or whatever. The power to come and just seize you and take you away to a military dungeon in the middle of the night and torture you and keep you there for the rest of your life. That is the ultimate power of all. If I'm a dictator, I'll relinquish everything else. Just give me that power, and I've got you. And that's why it's the most important thing. This is what unites us. I mean, and I'll take this opportunity to thank y'all for coming to this event, for welcoming us. We put this together, this program, the Future of Freedom Foundation, and when these two guys agreed to serve on this tour, it's the greatest honor for us at the Future of Freedom Foundation. One's a liberal, one's a conservative, and we got criticized at FFF. Hey, what are you guys doing, having a liberal on your program, Well, you can see why we have a liberal on this program. And these guys are my heroes. I go and read their stuff every day because they understand, that the concept of civil liberties trumps everything at this point of our lives.
Yes, sir.
I'd just like to ask, with the recent court case against the NDAA, can we really expect anything significant to change the result of that, or are we just going to see maybe another signing statement that says I'm just going to ignore that?
It's funny that you asked that because when that case, for those of you who don't know, there was a case commenced by a bunch of activists and journalists asking a federal court to enjoin the NDAA on the grounds that even though they hadn't yet been indefinitely detained under it, the mere threat of it made them relinquish their own constitutional rights out of fear, and then therefore they had standing to challenge it and claim it's unconstitutional. And remarkably, at the time when they commenced the suit, I didn't even bother to write about it because I was so sure they were going to be thrown out of court almost instantly, given the posture of the federal judiciary over the last 10 years, which was basically to endorse every form of government incursion into these rights. And amazingly, they found probably, one of the very few judges in the country, a new appointee relatively, and she did something very brave and said they do have standing to sue because they are already having their rights violated by the mere threat of this statute, and that now that they have the right to sue, she proceeded to say she's going to analyze the law and found the law to be unconstitutional and enjoined its ongoing enforcement. Her decision has already been stayed by the appellate court. I can almost guarantee you that the Second Circuit is going to reverse the decision and reinstate the constitutionality of the NDAA, probably by saying that the plaintiffs don't have standing, which has been the way that courts have protected government incursions, by saying that usually what happens is the government violates rights, but because they do it in total secrecy, no one person can prove that their rights have been violated. So if the government is eavesdropping on you without warrant, because you can't prove that you are somebody who was eavesdropped on because they've done it in secret and won't tell anybody who they've eavesdropped on, courts have said no one has standing to sue since you can't prove that you've actually been harmed by the program. This is what they're going to say. Since these people haven't yet been indefinitely detained, they don't have standing. They may go even further. But it's still an important victory because it does show that there still are people, even in the government, willing to adhere to their actual duties, which in the case of federal courts is to stand up to the executive branch when they assert powers that the Constitution plainly prohibits. But I wouldn't get excited about this case in the sense that it's ultimately going to lead to the invalidation of the law. It's almost certainly not going to do so. Unfortunately, federal courts have proven that they are not the proper venue for restoring any of these rights, even though the reason they have life tenure and the reason they exist is to protect those rights.
But I think, Glenn, it supports what you had said in your presentation about in times of war, the law is basically silent. If you go back to World War II in the Japanese concentration camps that I mentioned, two cases get to the Supreme Court. One's called Hirabayashi, one's called Korematsu versus the United States. And they start out with these great, glorious words. Racial distinctions are odious to a free people, but, and then they're all upheld, and the court runs away and doesn't want to do anything to it. So say we can't rely upon the federal judges there to protect the civil liberties that really should be the task of the Congress of the United States. But to go through, and I think, Glenn, just to add some additional color to the actual lawsuit, the Justice Department was asked by the judge, because the prohibition that triggers the authority to detain you is providing substantial assistance to an associate organization to a terrorist group. What is substantial assistance, and what Chris Hedges and other plaintiffs described as what they wanted to do to right or at least air the views of some of our so-called enemies. The department, is that substantial assistance or not? I don't know. We don't know whether that's substantial assistance. Can't give you an answer. Well, is this an associated group? Nope, can't tell that answer either. It was like defining obscenity as I know it when we see it and we'll decide at the time, which, of course, creates great chilling effect on those who ordinarily don't want to risk a long prison term for exercising their free speech rights.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I wanted to ask how any of you felt about the Second Amendment and individual gun rights and how that might help us slow the erosion of civil liberties.
Maybe we'll skip the Second Amendment question. It's getting a little bit late.
No, but the most important part of the Second Amendment that we discussed today is the militia clause, which was supposed to provide the ability to conduct self-defense without standing armies, which is obviously not as what's happened as we built an empire and whatever. The Supreme Court clearly has upheld there's some individual right to gun possession and subject to, like other rights, to reasonable regulation. But I think it's foolhardy to think that, given the arsenal that the Pentagon has, that with our handguns we're going to be able to face down, all those the tanks and the Stinger missiles and whatever.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So I guess my question sort of relates to civil liberties, but you, I think, pointed out very well the lack of education that seemed to be somewhat prevalent occasionally. And I'm wondering, what are your guys' thoughts on the current role that education plays in promoting the civil liberties, and how our government seems to be gutting the education system as it steamrolls into funding the military?
Well, I think education is key. I mean, the Founding Fathers understood that very well. George Washington's very first State of the Union message underscored the importance of an enlightened citizenry in order to keep the government in check, because ultimately public opinion and conventional wisdom is going to find its imprint on public policy. And the education system today, people know more who's American Idol than they know who sits on the Supreme Court, who was President of the United States. They don't understand Cemetery Ridge or the Civil War or anything else. And they don't without education, you will not understand the dangers that come in inches and in small steps that will ultimately crush all of your freedom and liberty. And if I had my way, I'd raise the civic standards in order to get any kind of high school diploma whatsoever. And it is the one place where the government ought to be most involved in educating and insisting upon passing these tests that show some fundamental understanding of separation of powers system. And of course, in some sense, it would rather have us all de facto lobotomized, so we're much more susceptible to being cowed and subjected to vassalage. But in some sense, the charter school movement and private schools are ways around the government public school system that certainly is much watered down to what it ought to be, and probably what it was 100 years ago.
Let me just add one thing to that, which is I had this sort of epiphany. Actually, it was part of our tour that we did, the first part. 6 months or so ago, we were at a college in Indiana. I forget, was it Purdue or I forget where it was. Yeah, Purdue. And there were 3 or 4 high school students, sophomores or juniors, who had driven several hours. They were students in Kentucky to come in here and speak, in part because they were having this war with their school administrators. They worked on their high school newspaper, and they wanted to interview me and have me say really mean things about their administrator so they could put my quotes in the thing, and I happily provided really nasty quotes. But anyway, the more important part of that was that afterwards they said, look, we listened to your speech, and you talked about, and the whole event was about how America had sort of radically changed in terms of civil liberties in the post 9/11 world versus what it had been in the pre 9/11 world. And they said, but for us and for people our age, and Jacob alluded to this earlier, but they said, we're 15 and 16 years old. We were 3, 4, 5 years old at the time of 9/11. There is no such thing as a pre 9/11 world for people of my age. In terms of our political consciousness, the things that you think are these radical changes are for us all we know. And it's really basically every year more and more people are becoming accustomed to think about all of these powers and the state of affairs as being normalized, as being natural, as not really having any kind of way to look toward anything else to compare it to. And so I think that the role of education has become particularly important if these things are going to be reversed, because you basically are having more and more people all the time come of age in a world in which they don't know any better. And the one reason why I'm encouraged, because I don't really see in any sort of short-term way the state suddenly deciding that indoctrinating people about the importance of civil liberties in the public school system is a really important priority. That to me doesn't seem very realistic. But what does seem encouraging is the advent of the internet. Which for a long time people promised we're going to fulfill all these great goals, and it took a long time and people became a little bit jaded. But the reality is that it does expose people, especially younger people who use the internet, who grew up on the internet, who basically live and breathe on it, to all sorts of opinions that they would otherwise be kept from. It's really democratized discourse. It's made the ideas that we're being exposed to much less homogenized, and that I think is one of the most important reasons for optimism, is that, it used to be 10 years ago that if you wanted to reach a large audience, you had to go work for a large media corporation. Now you can go on the internet, be completely independent, and find ways to have your voice really heard. And that I think is a really important thing to think about, is how that weapon, how that tool can be exploited to advance some of the goals we're talking about tonight.
Let me give it a libertarian perspective on your question. As a libertarian, we call for the total separation of school and state, just like we have church and state. We dismantle the whole public school system, and that includes government-approved private schools that are licensed. And the reason is because it has nothing to do with education. It has to do with inculcating this sense of submissive, good little citizens that will defer to the state. And that's why we have the society in which we live, where everybody defers to the military and praises the troops and just submits and complacent, because they've been inculcated with this mindset. And that's why the governments in every country control the educational system. There's a great essay today, and this is going to be part of the resources I'll send you out if you give us your email address, today by a guy named John Whitehead of the Rutherford Institute. And this is a great organization, conservative, but solid on civil liberties. This guy Whitehead's the president. He's got a great article today on public schooling creating the good little submissive citizen. And that's really its purpose, and that's its effect. We would say ditch the whole thing.
All right. We've got two more for questions. This gentleman and the lady behind him.
Hi, thank you for coming tonight. I wanted to ask a question related to the incidents that we had here at our university last year, but in the context of the broader Occupy movement and some of the other protests that have gone on. You mentioned that the police violence that's happened at quite a number of these protests serves to frighten the population and prevent them from participating in these types of protests, but I think it also actually serves another purpose, which is actually directly obscures the content of the protests itself. And we saw that here, where after the pepper spraying incident, there was very little discussion of the reasons that those students were protesting, which were in some cases related to the Occupy movement, and in others more directly to tuition increases and the privatization of the university. And I think we saw that in Oakland as well, where the intense police brutality ended up sort of diverting a lot of the activities of that Occupy group to protesting police brutality specifically. And I'm wondering if, I know that Mr. Greenwald, you write about the media in particular quite a bit. I'm wondering if any of you have ideas for how, without avoiding the issues of police brutality, we can maintain in the consciousness of the society the actual reasons and content for the protests as we have them in the future.
Yeah, it's a great question and not an easy one to answer. I do actually think that despite the truth of what you said, which is that in lots of ways the confrontation with the police and the use of excess force became the story, supplanting the original message of the Occupy movement, that the Occupy movement nonetheless did get its message out in a way that shaped and changed public consciousness and public discourse better than probably, I don't want to say any movement of the last decade, but certainly as well as any. I mean, I actually think the Tea Party movement, again, the sort of good version of it, did so in similar ways as well, because I think they were actually much more similar than is typically appreciated. But I think that the Occupy movement, the reason why I ultimately am so encouraged about the Occupy movement, and it sort of relates to what I was just talking about with the power of the internet, is that what ended up happening with the Occupy movement is it began as a group of small and sort of familiar activists, people who had been activists for quite some time, who had been protesting lots of these same injustices. But it grew very rapidly into this organic force where the way in which it transmitted this message was almost kind of a throwback. It was almost sort of primitive. It was people who were gathering in the same place, and in this pure democracy, instead of protesting the lack of democracy in the United States, they said, we are going to create our own democracy, which is what the General Assemblies were, which was all the voting, all the consensus building. And this process drew in huge numbers of people who had never previously been politically active, who had never thought about these issues before. And simply through the process of communication, Jacob was saying earlier, the power of ideas, spreading these messages, communicating with one another, educating people directly. It's sort of the model of social media, but offline, really persuaded huge numbers of people to think about corporate cronyism and oligarchy and just massive corruption at the top of the society who had never thought about it before. It forced into the discourse all kinds of ideas that were previously excluded about growing and massive income inequality and power inequality. And so I think it served as a really great model. Yes, the police brutality part of it did exist, but that's also an important part of the message. But I think in lots of ways that are kind of inspiring and important in terms of the template it created, it did end up spreading its message probably in a more potent way than I think we appreciate, in a sort of more subtle way, but in a more effective way. And I think it's a good model. It's a good template. It sort of was one of those spontaneous things that happened without much planning. Only a very few people who sort of were the driving force behind it at the beginning. And it spread really quickly. It resonated. It tapped into the growing sense that electoral politics provides no real avenue for change. And it sparked a lot of political energy, unlike anything we've seen for a lot of quite some time. So I think it's important to take note of all the positive it achieved.
Okay, one last question.
First, I wanted to thank you, Glenn, for bringing up the kind of political persecution and repression of anarchists, especially recently, maybe within the past year, and bring up that there are currently 3 anarchists in Seattle that are in jail for refusing to basically talk to the FBI and respond to grand jury summons. So that's something that's very contemporary and is happening right now. And then also maybe to return quickly to the pepper spray incident. Many of my friends were actually pepper sprayed last year. And yeah, to return to what the purpose of that was, which was to fight the privatization of public education. And those students were very concerned with keeping the UC system accessible for people of color and poor students. And I think it's really kind of critical that we see the militarization of campuses as part of the privatization process, and then also see that as a larger trend of capitalism kind of subsuming public education, and that's not just a phenomena in the United States, but in fact that's happening all over the world. We've seen mass student movements against privatization in Montreal and Chile and Mexico and Europe and lots of other sites. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about kind of privatization in the context of capitalism or neoliberalism and how it relates to militarization.
Yeah, I mean that's a lot of different topics, and none of them is easy to address. And so, at the risk of sort of evading your question, which I don't want to do, at least not completely, I think that the crux of the issue is what I was talking about earlier, which is that there is a growing sense among not just people on the left, but even people on the right, which I think was one of the prime impetus for the Tea Party, that even in the economic realm, perhaps especially in the economic realm, there is this massive corruption that is undermining any sense of fair and equal opportunity. And once people start to perceive that economically their opportunity is being suffocated, which absolutely is not just the perception, but the reality now, then I think the only type of response that becomes inevitable and that becomes rational is mass protest movements, is instability. That's what really ultimately spawns real disruption in every single society, is the sense that there's no economic opportunity, that there's economic deprivation that's growing and suffocating and that one can't evade. And so I think that a lot of these movements are about that, and I think that the erosion of civil liberties, the paramilitarization of police forces, the privatization of the use of force, which you see corporations having their own private forces now, campuses are way more armed and way more militarized in terms of their security forces than ever before, is all about a reaction to that, about a way of trying to pacify that and to keep people, under control and to make them acquiesce to it. And this is, to me, the real battle, which is, as the state consolidates power and consolidates the ability to transgress these limits, how willing are people to stand up to it? Because it is difficult, it's risky, it's scary, and it's dangerous. And ultimately, every right that any citizenry has is dependent upon their willingness to fight for it. And rights don't exist that aren't willing to be fought for. And so this is really the core battle to me. And it can manifest in different ways. You might be on different sides of it on specific issues, but ultimately I think that's what is really all driving it.
Okay, well, on behalf of Young Americans for Liberty and the Future of Freedom Foundation, I really appreciate y'all joining us tonight on this presidential debate night, and hopefully have had a much more interesting and productive discussion here. Thank you.